Okay, so good morning again. So, and very pleased to see you. We are after a few, 3 months now. Still, everybody is connected until the last day. So, and I mean, this week in particular, we are super treated. Huh? Yesterday, we had Stefano Pintarelli. That I was, I mean, very pleased to see the discussion and somehow also summarizing and putting together the linking the dots of the various issues we've been discussing in this last 3 months. And I mean, today we can even go further, and I'm particularly pleased to have here Birgit and Matthias. I will introduce in a second. And clearly you can ask, as usual, all you would never dare to ask in public. I mean, because here we can really have the voice of the experts, and with different perspective and different background and knowledge. So, and also combined with your expertise, I'm sure we will. I mean, the 1 hour and a half we have won't be enough, but at least we start the discussion to conclude this model. So again, as I said, I'm very glad that we have these three high-level experts. In particular, I will just quickly introduce, and then we go and just prepare yourself, because we want to make a panel as usual. So we won't have like 2 hours discussion and then 2 minutes for questions. We do the other way around. So we will have a couple of let's say introductory questions and statements, and then actually it's up to you to ask questions and comment on what we are, what we've been already looking at, what is on the pipeline. Birgit and Matthias knows that we had introduction to the AI Act by colleagues of the Commission that are behind that, and also as Stefan already anticipated yesterday, Gabriele and other colleagues of DG Connect, they were observing the work of the high-level expert group that were discussing these various issues. So we had not only Stefano yesterday, but also Andrea Renda that was in the high-level expert group. And so very happy to have here Gri, that is another member of this high-level expert group. And I would say one of the, with Andrea and Stefano, the most influential in the debate. And you will see why. And so I'm particularly pleased also because Gri lead with me the InTouchAI.eu project, so the international outreach for human-centric AI, and maybe we can also discuss a bit of that later. But she's also, she's the co-founder of Data Ethics, that is a think, do, tank, together with Birgit and other powerful colleagues. And in fact, she's also involved in the Data Pollution and Power Initiative at the University of Bonn with Jaime van Biesberg and other influential scholars and experts in the field at the ethics, Science and Ethics Sustainable AI Lab. But also, I mean, I'm super happy because Gri will. I mean, she's just published her second book on data ethics of power, a human approach in the big data and AI era. And so we have basically the avant-premiere, because she will present this officially on Monday. So we are particularly, lucky. And so also because it just came out this week. I mean, she will tell us more. And then, of course, there was an idea to present, I guess, yesterday, but it's been postponed to Monday. So it's even more premiere for us. And Birgit, I mean, is also, one of the top experts on this field in Europe and worldwide. She's a partner at Carve Consulting, and also co-founder of Data Ethics with Gri and Pernille. And she's in particular focusing on, advice to companies on how to use technologies like AI, and also the link with the green transition. Maybe we'll be back on that. And she's specifically focusing on procurement of AI. That will be one of the topics we will also address more in the next module after the Christmas break. And of course, she has also published on this field quite a lot, and has a lot of focus, especially on privacy, discrimination, diversity, and other and the fundamental rights. The link with the fundamental rights and values. That is also one of the issues that we were discussing with Matthias. Is one of the focus of the debate at the political and also technical level. So Matthias Braun is leading for FAU, the Friedrich Alexander University in Germany, the group on ethics and governance of emerging technologies, and actually has incredible background from biology to Protestant theology, and of course focusing on social, anthropological, and theological ethical issues. And specifically focusing on the political ethics of artificial intelligence, big data, but also specific perspective of health, genome editing, and medicine. That is an area that is, of course, particular, let's say, importance when it comes to ethics. But anyway, with no further ado, because otherwise, if we go through all what our three panelists have done, we go to next year. So I will. I mean, we decided to structure this in a way that Birgit, and Matthias, let's say, introduce a bit of their work. And then then we have a bit of discussion, and then we, as I said, we move to you, so you can ask questions. So if we all agree on that, and maybe then we do in a kind of, we do a first round and then a second round, maybe in a reverse order, and then we go to the participants. Okay, so I will start with Gri. So I just looked at the various commentaries on your book, and there's one I liked in particular. Say, Data Ethics of Power by Gri Hasselbalch provides a deeply impactful approach to a subject typically bogged down by technical or political dogma, by identifying the systems of power that create the highest levels of obfuscation around data. So, and then, the more, let's say, the more official, let's say, presentation says that the book takes a reflective and fresh look at the ethical implication of transforming everyday life and the world through the effortless, costless, and seamless accumulation of extra layers of data. So, we see this also in our work, and maybe later we can discuss on In Touch AI, but you have a specific and distinct perspective on this topic. So also because you have been fighting in the high-level expert group on the ethics guidelines. So how you link this also to the debate on values. So maybe if you want to share with us your perspective.
Sure, Gianluca, thank you for that very, very nice introduction. I'm all blushing now. Yeah, well, you already kind of basically said where I come from and what I'm doing. So I'm going to say a little bit more about my new book, which I think is probably what's the most interesting thing in my life right now and my work, apart from all the things that I do with In Touch AI, of course. So my old book, I've actually wrote a book before together with Pernille Tranberg, who's another data ethics co-founder, which was originally just, it's funny to say, because it was actually when we were writing that book, data ethics was, the very term data ethics was very unfashionable, or at least we couldn't find it anywhere. I think it's one of the first books that actually used the word data ethics. So that's interesting. So my new book, you could say is a more academic book. It's taking point of departure in a lot of the literature that's been written about the information society, and in particular this kind of analysis of the transformation of powers in the information society. And what I'm then looking at is more the big data and AI era, that we can call it. So an era that's very much characterized by these new transformative technologies. So there's not really much surprise in that focus, but I think more importantly, thinking about this work in this field that I've been in for so many years, and many of you that I can imagine have also been part of, is that this book what I'm trying to do with this book is to, Gianluca, he mentioned this like focus on values, but what I'm trying to do is to move the focus from just focusing of the values of data ethics, which as we can see in the current debate on can basically be any value, to kind of readjust our attention to the power as the main, or power structures in general as this main focal point for data ethics. So, I mean, basically, when we think about it, so we always had data systems. We've always had them to make sense of and to organize and to control our life and society. And generally, when we look at these data systems, registers, for example, all these kind of data systems we used in history, they always reinforce power dynamics, and very often with very devastating consequences. But one thing we have to think about now is that they've also transformed throughout history. So this kind of conversion of all these things that we have in as Gianluca also quoted from the introduction of my book, is this kind of effortless, costless, and this seamless extra layer of life in society. That's one transformation that I think requires a very particular kind of reflection and awareness from us. And this is where we come to this point of data ethics. So at this moment in time, what we can also see is that there's very different approaches to AI and data, and they're competing both at these national, also at regional, at global levels, for what we could call a technological momentum, where we have these local systems that are evolving into these more larger integrated global systems. And we have this kind of competition at the same time playing out in front of our eyes between different styles of scientists, different technological systems, different ways of doing technologies, of developers and entrepreneurs, and also with, as we see, different kinds of requirements and also expectations from citizens and from lawmakers. But what I think is sometimes the problem here is that we see this without a real open conversation about these kind of underlying power dynamic structures. And that's why the very book is like a proposal for what I call a data ethics of power, which is basically concerned with making visible the distribution of power and the power relation in this what we call big data and AI society. And this is to create what we call a basis for alternative designs and business and policies and social and what we could also focus on as cultural processes that support which we could call a more human-centric distribution of power. What I won't take too much more time, but I think one thing is really important when we talk about data ethics and this debate about also data ethics and AI ethics and these things, is that we look at it with different kind of analytical glasses. So we look at it from different levels. If you're a sociologist, you might know these terms very well: the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. So if we look at powers and interests, for example, at the micro level, we can think about interest in data that can be identified in the very design of, for example, an AI system. So we have to think about the kind of interest, the powers that are embedded in the data design process. How is a data design choice made? Is there an alternative data design? What are the barriers and enablers for creating this kind of data ethical environment that we want? And on a meso level, then we can think about institutions and companies and governments and intergovernmental organizations. So how are they negotiating interests, values, these cultural frameworks that I talked about before for the practices in, for example, standards and legal frameworks. And then on the macro level, we have this that I also mentioned before, this kind of a geopolitical battle right now. So how do we understand these interests of powers that are invested in geopolitical battles between these different approaches to data and AI? So for example, everyone is talking about the European approach, one that I've been promoting, that Gianluca is promoting in the InTouch AI, which has a very particular characteristic and which is kind of competing with other kind of geopolitical interests in this debate. And all of the kind of the structure of these power relations is in the end what will kind of create the infrastructure for the kind of data AI environment that we want. So I won't take any more time. I was supposed to be short, but I think I was a little bit longer than I was supposed to be.
No, that's fantastic. Thanks a lot, Giri. And of course, we'll be back on this issue of the digital geopolitics that has been actually, the very first day of lecture we had Claudio Feijo discussing exactly also on this, and then we touched this several times because, of course, is I would say embedded in the discussion of AI in government, and we have seen this also because of the different roles that the government plays. So it's a great way to end this let's say first part of the master with going further on this, especially because a lot of things happened in these 3 months in these topics, and more will happen especially in the first part of 2022, as who works in this field knows with the various the national discussion. But also, I mean, and you mentioned the tensions and the power struggle between different stakeholders and actors. And so on this, Birgit, I mean, I think she deals with this every day as part of her work, because, I mean, she also looked at the issue of sustainability. And this is an integral part, when you want to run a profitable business, no? And so on one side, there is the issue of how you comply with GDPR, the issue of data ethics, but also the human rights aspects. And on the other side, I mentioned this before, now there's a lot of emphasis on the digital and the green twin transition. So how can we make sure, that data is also part of this, especially when we look at the, potential anti-corruption, let's say, practices. And on this, I know from your work that you have a specific, let's say, pragmatic approach to compliance or risk governance approach. Maybe you can tell us a bit more on this.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'm a lawyer by background, so and I'm embedded in human rights law. So I apply this. I used to say that I'm a human rights lawyer or fundamental rights lawyer. So adhering very much to the whole value base that we have in the EU treaty and the EU legislation. And that's also my way into working with procurement of AI. We do have, so the pragmatic perspective on this is that when I'm working with companies but also authorities and organizations, it's extremely important that you can actually take a new concept, transform it into specific requirements, and integrate them in existing structures. So it's not that we can enter into a company and say, now you have to set up a new structure for accommodating the needs for data ethics or sustainability or GDPR. So we have to integrate it in existing structures. And when I look at the whole EU setup on procurement, the procurement directive, then we actually have a very nice structure. We have a systematized approach to working with procurement that can also be used when we want to set up new and specific requirements to suppliers on data ethics. And we have been working with that in data ethics. Gry and I did a paper on procurement of AI solutions and services, public procurement, but it can easily be applied by companies and other actors in the private sectors. I just added it to the chat. And in this paper on public procurement of AI solutions and services, we actually show how we can take the the way we work with procurement in many companies inspired by the procurement directive, and then simply start by making an analysis, the preliminary risk assessments, where we include not only business aspects, economic aspects, quality aspects, but also fundamental rights in a fundamental rights assessment, a broader compliance assessment where we could include also anti-corruption, money laundering, and so forth. But the idea is also to start already at that point by finding out which data ethical principles should apply to this system that we are acquiring, and start to find out what are the risks that are a consequence, or what are the consequences from running an AI system, for instance, in a smart city, or to support the payment of public services, healthcare services, social services, or social security schemes, and so forth. So what are the inherent risks from a data ethics perspective? And also, when you have started that process, started working with all these issues, it's kind of just to follow the line and say, okay, but when we go out there to do a preliminary screening in the market of new suppliers for this AI solution that we want to develop or operate, what is it that we are looking for? And this becomes actually very specific requirements. You could say we're working with an AI solution, and we know we have uncovered a risk for bias, for instance, and leading to discrimination, leading to inequality. How can we address that when we start screening suppliers? And one way is actually to look a bit more into how are the organizational structures with the suppliers? Do they have diversity in their teams? Is that a goal for them actually to set up teams with a representation of not only gender and age, but also different ethnic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, different experiences from different parts of the world? We know already now that, and I'm sure you know all the examples, that it's a huge problem out there, that we have, for instance, the Siri and the Alexa, the robots, the chatbots that Apple and Google use. They are trained on male voices, meaning that up to 80% of women are not understood by these robots. And how can we actually prevent that, or by asking suppliers, how do you actually work with development of the algorithms? Who define the variables on the algorithm, so that we can ensure that we do not have such results and such consequences for huge groups of the population. And by doing this, by actually engaging in such process, engaging in such assessments and discussions with suppliers, I think it is possible actually also to integrate specific requirements in the both exclusion criteria and selection criteria in the procurement phase, and it may also be reflected in the technical specifications that we set up in the contract. And again, evaluating the contract performance and so forth, then you can again control whether the supplier will meet all these requirements. So what we are looking into is to, of course, to take our point of departure in AI being human-centric, but what does that mean? We have to simply transform it into specific criteria that would talk about how do you enable the users, how do you empower the users to have control of their data in an AI system? How do we ensure that it doesn't, as I said before, that it has an impact on equality and discrimination and so forth? But also, and I think that is probably a new part, it was mentioned in the high-level group, and I have tried to introduce it in many companies, but it's not really something that they take on, but we can see it in the research article also now from academia, that we start looking at what is the environmental footprint from working with AI. What is I just read an article the other day where the scientists actually put this, it's just a few lines in the article saying from the test period we have measured this footprint, CO2 footprint. So that could actually be one of, in the future, a specific data ethics requirement that you also can demonstrate what your CO2 footprint or broader environmental footprint is from running an AI supported system. Broader societal consequences would also be included. And that is where it differs from a GDPR risk assessment, where we look into the risk for discrimination for the single data subject. From a data ethical perspective, we would also look into what are the consequences for society. It could be democratic consequences, the lack of possible opportunity to participate in social life, cultural life, and so forth. So I think that, but we will come back to that. That's some of the challenges that we have. But just to sum up, then I think that we already have a very nice system when we look at the legislative basis. We have the procurement directive that provides us with a structure. We have already in all companies, in all authorities, we have processes for procurement, and the way forward is actually to integrate all these new data ethics considerations and requirements into existing structures, and I do think that's possible.
Thanks a lot, Birgit. I mean, I see from the chat that there's a lot of interest on these, and yes, and also this is one of the issues that is probably also is setting the ground for international collaboration, also in reference to Canada and other countries. And I mean, also last week we had another friend and colleague that was also Aurélie Jacquet mentioning about the role of standards, and clearly this is also part of the debate. But as you say, we'll be back on these, on the challenges, and in particular, and then turning to Matthias, I was looking at your very productive production of a rich production of papers and articles, and you have a specific focus. I also know you have a different perspective, and that's also what is good in the panel, that we don't necessarily agree on everything, but we will be back on that. But there is the issue specifically of digital twins that was mentioned by Birgit, and particularly in the health sector, so in medicine, and maybe is there a different ethics for when it comes to health and medicine, or specific risk that, of course, in this sensitive area we have to address with particular, let's say, care, as it is in fact somehow in the current debate, on having a risk-based approach. Matthias, yeah.
Okay, I didn't realize that this was a question for me. I thought it was a question for Birgit. Okay, sorry.
No.
Okay, so yeah, thank you, and hello to everybody. Thank you for the nice introduction, Gianluca, and the really thought-provoking comments by Gry and Birgit. So I have decided to perhaps just put 3 ideas on the table with regard to the comments by Gry and Birgit. To try to figure out where we perhaps have something we can debate and discuss about. And of course, later we can also debate about prediction in health and digital twins and so on. But to my view, this would be a completely new field of debate. So perhaps first I would try to respond to the points made by Gry and Birgit, and then perhaps we can later on also come to the section of prediction in health and so on. So as I just mentioned, I have 3 ideas or 3 questions, I think, which underlie the points made by Gry and Birgit. And the 3 are: the first one is the one of framing and framework. The second one is the one of methods with regards to data ethics and AI ethics. And the third one is the thing also Birgit put on the table of discrimination and marginalization caused by algorithmic biases or specific uses of artificial intelligence. So the first one is the one of framing, and I think this is a really central issue and something where we do have a debate within the field of ethics, but also within the field of social science, political science, with regard to ethical question. And this is a really fundamental issue. So what is the task of ethics here? So what could ethics provide to a political debate? What kind of recommendation can or should ethics give or be able to give? But also, where are the limits and the limitations out of such an ethical perspective? And this is also really a political question, because as you all know, for example, with regard to the debate on the UNESCO idea of a common global perspective on artificial intelligence, there was this interesting debates if the UNESCO should focus on ethics in order to provide new ideas how to deal with ethical challenges, or if this is a question for politics, and for example, you should think about regulation and regulational and issues, and I think this is also a debate with regards to several groups, as for example the high-level group on artificial intelligence, or other recommendational bodies or ethics bodies, where you always have this, do you face this question, in how far are we doing ethics here, or are we doing politics in the name of ethics? But perhaps we should be honest about that and be clear of what we are doing here. And so in our group, we have this very basic idea, which has been brought to the table by the sociologist Niklas Luhmann, and he defined to say, well, the first task of ethics is to warn against moral. So there's this idea that the task of ethics is to be a critical theory, and not to be something which you say, well, you be an ally of several interests or several stakeholders, but ethics can reflect on moral, can reflect on values, can make recommendations, but you cannot justify specific political actions with regard to ethical theories or specific values. And perhaps it's a specific approach, and we can think about this, but I just would like to put this on the table because this becomes really important. For example, when we think about just terms, for example, trustworthy AI or human-centric AI, we do have, or sometimes some scholars argue that, for example, trustworthy AI would provide some clarity, or would give you a kind of check to say, well, when you do it like this or that, you have developed trustworthy AI. And there is this kind of ambiguity within a societal debate where you still can argue, so what do you mean when you say this is trustworthy AI? Is there also room for distrust, perhaps for different societal groups to say, well, we do not have this kind of trust, and perhaps we do not even want to have this kind of trust. And what does this mean for developing specific technological approaches? And what would this mean for thinking about trust or for human-centric AI? And I think this is also an important issue, as we just mentioned, with regard to the geopolitical dimension, because we there have this kind of idea to use a specific kind of common values or specific kind of common morality to say, well, this is the kind of European or the kind of US style of a specific set of values or a bundle of values, or this is a Chinese one. And then we frame it like, okay, well, the Chinese one is the one of surveillance, the US one is a kind of economic power, and the European one is the one of human-centric or human rights based approach. And there you can see that you try to provide a kind of clarity, use it in the political sphere, which has a kind of violence or the danger of becoming violence, and using it as a form of power, which perhaps also brings you in some difficulties and leads to also ethical dilemmas in dealing with these issues. So this is my first point about framing. My second one is a more specific one about methods. And it's about thinking, so what could be the role of principles, of ethical principles with regard to AI ethics? And there I have done a bit of work together with Brent Mittelstadt from Oxford, who has made or raised the point that perhaps we have to think about the specific context in which we use principles, and this has a consequence in how far we could just apply principles in order to provide some kind of ethical recommendation or provide ethical deliberation. And he made the point, and I think this is really important for our debate here, that there is a really important distinction between medical ethics and AI ethics with regard to using principles. And his argument, and I would just like to put this on the table, is that in medical ethics, we have a broad discussion about the use and the role of principles. And for example, some scholars within AI ethics just proceed the idea to say, well, okay, we just take the principles out of medical ethics and apply them, or perhaps adjust them with regard to AI ethics. And of course, we can do this, but then there occurs at least 4 problems. And the first one is that with regard to the field of medical ethics, we do have something like a common aim to say, well, what should a clinician do? What should he focus on? What is the task within the field of medical and clinical ethics? And we do not have this kind of definition with regard to AI ethics. So this is a kind of preliminary foundation when you use these principles that you say, well, these are comparable fields. And as Bernd Mittelstadt, for example, would argue, there is a difference between this field of AI ethics and medical ethics with regard to common aims. Also, and this is the second point, with regard to professional history and the question, what kind of norms, what kind of perhaps also failures have been made, and what have we learned of them? What kind of standards have we defined? And when you look at the history of medicine, you see that there has been done a lot of failures and also established a lot of standards in order to deal with these failures. And his argument is that this history and this historical perspective is really important when you think about applying principles from one context to the other. And then you also make the point about robust legal statements and proven methods how to do this. And I think this is really important when we think about principles, to have this in mind, that you cannot just take, for example, the 4 principles of medical ethics and just apply them or perhaps adjust them and say, well, okay, let's not speak about justice, but in the terms of ethics, we speak about fairness. And then we do have a really robust corpus of principles. I think that you can do this, but there are some thresholds and some perhaps also backlashes you do not want to have or you do not want to face. And just to be really short, the third one, and this is something my group and we are really just in current research ideas and just at the very beginning about understanding this is the issues of discrimination and marginalization with regard to algorithmic bias in decision making with regard to health. And something I'm really started thinking about, and I think this is something Birgit and Gry are also thinking about, is the relation of data justice or justice of standards and procedures of justice with regard to algorithmic decision making and the relation to solidaric actions. And the idea from our side is that perhaps we should learn something from medical ethics and look on the current failures, the current injustices produced by the use of algorithmic systems in order to understand what kind of marginalizations, what kind of injustices are already appearing right now and how we can tackle them. And perhaps this could be a way not to think about abstract principles and abstract theories, but by being solidaric with those being at risk, by integrating those who are marginalized, for example, with regard to a specific race or specific kind of color, and you have this kind of debate about biases. Something like a capabilities approach of justice could, and we perhaps new forms of data solidarity could be needed and could be define a kind of practice, a kind of new form of action in order to tackle this discrimination or this experiences of discrimination and marginalization, and try to to re-entangle the forms of already established power by using the experiences to say, well, we would like to avoid, we would like to this kind of discrimination, we would like to establish concrete pathways, design processes in order to avoid new forms of discrimination and injustices. So this just as to put something on the table, and now I think we have a lot to debate.
Thanks a lot, Matthias. Actually, you put a lot on the table, and I'm sure that Gry and Birgit want to react to that. But and I mean, of course, you discussed also one of the important issue that I mean is about the governance of AI. You know that there is this attempt. We had this workshop in Slovenia during the high-level conference we organized. In fact, where one of the attempt or one of the idea behind the AI Act is also in fact to look at other fields like in the medicine and try to emulate or find at least inspiration for how to govern these complex phenomena, and also considering, as you say, the technology diplomacy aspect of it. That is an area we are particularly, of course, focusing also in this master, as we said. But this is important also. I mean, in this respect. So, if you look at one of your paper, if there is a formula for trustworthy AI, so I believe you have the answer on that. Is a kind of leap of faith, no? So, but on the other side, and especially if we move to the global governance aspect of artificial intelligence, and this, I mean, tension and political aspect that are clearly there. You also did some work on, the topics of data sovereignty, and how so how you see these not only in the health domain, but in general. So how this could, then what should be then the position also of the European industry or the European governments? So in this domain, that I mean, at the moment there is this quite strong ambition of Europe to lead the digital decade, and the digital and data sovereignty is one of the assumptions of this. So how you see that from an ethical perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Gianluca. So, okay, I could talk hours about this, but just to put it really short, I think perhaps to be a bit provocative, also knowing that it would be necessary to distinguish a bit more. So to be a bit provocative, I would say there is this idea within the EU to say, well, with digital sovereignty, you think of sovereignty in a strong sense. There is this idea to say, well, we do have a kind of clarity with regard to our values. We do have a kind of common body of a specific set of values. We do have perhaps a really successful history of applying human rights. And I think, well, this is perhaps not wrong, but you will not be able, by referring to specific values, or it would not be clever, and you will also cause new forms of violence when you put sovereignty as a form on the table to say, well, here is our strong approach, our clear perspective on how to use power, and not be aware of the kind of ambivalences and ambiguities really being in the center of each of these values, of each of this kind of principle. And so our work on, for example, sovereignty was to say, well, we should perhaps understand sovereignty in a weak sense, to say, well, this is not a kind of conquering idea. This is not the idea of having a strong power to rule the world and combat all the other kind of approaches, but it is a kind of starting point to discuss and to reflect on specific forms of injustices, to reflect on specific forms of failures, and then to build perhaps on a particular level and on a local level new forms of combating and fighting such concrete experiences of injustices. And this was what I meant with the idea to the capability approach, to say, well, and then when we look on this particular and local actions, we can perhaps learn and understand what kind of action really works very well and what kind of action perhaps causes new forms of violence. And this was what I mean with a weak form of Serenity. And to my view, the current idea within the EU Commission is to have a bit of strong Serenity, which a form of power combined with this idea of Serenity, which will lead to new forms of discrimination, marginalization, and also violence.
We can then open the debate. I'm sure there are also in the participants' opinion on these. And I mean, clearly there is something I'm sure Agree will come back later on also on the topic of the ethics by design, no? That probably it's connected to this, that could be one of the approach. But before that, and maybe more, I mean, going back to the pragmatic approach, because then, okay, how we move from, you know, the principle, the values, the theoretical approaches, and to the, you know, to the procurement of AI, no? And Birgit started with that, and there are many challenges. But then also now the Commission is putting on the table this Adopt AI program, where the public sector in particular should play a role. I mean, we don't know much yet. There is a study ongoing on that. But maybe Birgit, given the focus of, you know, this, I mean, the discussion here more on the role of the public sector, how you see the things that, how can we make sure that exactly some of the critical point that Matthias put on the table can be addressed, and making sure that, I mean, we are not just otherwise, you know, a weak approach, but then we will be just data colonized by others in Europe. So how we do that?
I think there are so many things that I would like to address, but one thing, the first thing is that sometimes it's really nice to be a lawyer, because the world is actually more simple as a lawyer, simply because we have legislation, we adopt legislation, and then it's valid. It's a binding document. Everybody has to adhere to this new piece of legislation. And that's where lawyers typically stop. We do not concentrate on implementation, ethics by design, security by design, and all that. Others have to deal with that. But I think the point of departure is extremely important when working in this area, simply because if you look at the EU, to me, there's no doubt that all pieces of legislation will have to be anchored in the treaty. So we have the value base, it is defined. We have the charter with the fundamental rights, it is defined. So for me, it's not something that we have to start looking for in history and what we have already done and how can we learn from that. No, we simply have to apply the principles, and we simply have to apply the principles in the field of AI. And that is the development that we see right now, and the activities that we see in the EU right now, that they are very much focused on how to set up a framework that will not only guide, but show the way forward on how to use AI to the benefit of the citizens in Europe, the market, our economy, and the European societies. And that, I think, is extremely important to have a point of departure. When then looking at a broader perspective and see, you challenge it a little bit, Matthias, and say, now we have the EU, I know about the data sovereignty idea and all that, but I think that's a way to profile and to show power, because we have a lot of detailed legislation, so we are ahead of other countries. But I think for me, what is the decisive element is that we do have common values globally. We do have the human rights conventions that have been adopted by the UN. All new states have either succeeded to the conventions following other states, or new states are actually adopting. And I know that the human rights convention are not implemented, followed, complied with in a lot of countries throughout the world. But we have these countries who have actually been sitting down and thinking about, is this a set of value that we can actually adhere to and want to adhere to in the future? So I think it's not fair to say that we do not have a common ground for discussing values. So having said that, I think, I don't know if when you talk about ethics in medicine, I think that's also an area where we have to look into the European legislation. We have the Convention on Bioethics back from 1997 from the Council of Europe. And it actually has an Article 2 that say primacy of the human being, and stipulates that the interests and welfare of the human being shall prevail over the sole interest of society and research and science. So, I mean, we have a lot of things already that could be applied in this new setting where we talk about AI, and simply stressing, instead of stressing that we do not have a common ground, then saying we do have a common ground. We actually find all the principles that Guri and I are talking about when we talk about data ethics, and they are all embedded in human rights thinking and in EU policy and legislation. And that'll take me to my last point, and that is that when it's quite interesting right now, if you look at the development within the EU, when Ursula von der Leyen, when she was introduced 2 years ago, she actually said that we would see a directive on data ethics within 5 months. That was her plan. The first plan that she actually mentioned was to have this directive. If you look at the EU activities now, the word data ethics has disappeared. We talk about trustworthy AI, we talk about AI, but what we do is we do not talk about data ethics. We talk about how to anchor these new activities in fundamental rights and values, which I think is interesting. And it's also reflected in, for instance, the European Board of Data Protection. We had a conference on data ethics, when was that? 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I think, where we discussed what is data ethics. And the conclusion it was privacy commissioners and data protection authorities from all over the world discussing adopting a declaration. And what they came up with was actually to say that data ethics is about how we interpret legislation. So it's guiding for our interpretation. It's guiding for our assessments of whether we need new legislation or not. And it's also that those reflections that will spark the initiatives to new legislation. And that, I think, is a very nice way of defining data ethics. Because, I mean, if you go to the core of what you see of data ethics also in the high-level group, then it's about fundamental rights in a new context, in a new society, and with a new technology.
Well, thanks a lot, Birgit. And well, maybe I don't remember in which meeting we were discussing this, but I guess now with the new French presidency, at least some of the documents that are circulating, it seems the focus would be more on the data governance rather than just on the on the AI. But let's see. But then, of course, the two things are strictly interconnected. So, and that's where, in fact, I mean, even in the InTouch AI project with GRI, we are dealing with this issue. Okay, we have the UN values. So we have the legislation that has been put forward. There are other approaches. There are the standards, different values, and different, or at least different perspective in the countries around the world. So, I mean, how can we, let's say, find a balance or a compromise, or should we do it? So maybe, I don't know, Gri, what's what we do, how we do it?
Yeah, let me come with the solution. Well, actually, one of my key points is always to say that some of the power lies also in who defines the problems and the solutions then, and how problems are defined, and what kind of solutions we come up with after that. So I'm going to stay away from to presenting a solution. Now, where to start? Because I mean, I think there's been the most like this. There's so many interesting things that's been said before me that I would like to pick up on, but like the overall picture of things is that I mean, the way I see it is always, I see it very much in a kind of historical perspective and in a perspective of kind of this social technical transformations where there are different phases in society, where different stakeholders come together around exactly identifying specific problems and then coming up with solutions or ways forward or directions or things like that. So, I mean, while I do see, I mean, we do have legislation, we have different kind of standards, we have expert groups and all these things. And the way I would like to see this is to see these as components of these kind of negotiations that are slowly coming together over time and this is a dangerous word to use, but in kind of a grand narrative, revisiting a grand narrative of some of the ideas that we saw, as Birgitte said before, in the fundamental rights framework and the human rights framework, but revisiting these and understanding how do they apply in this new environment. So right now, you're right, Gianluca, there are some competing narratives, and I think it's really interesting. Birgitte, you mentioned before that we do have a common approach and a commonality globally. And we did sit down after the Second World War, for example, and negotiate and agree on this framework. But still, when I look at this in terms of the development of these big data technologies and AI technologies, there's quite a controversy in the way we apply this and implement this. And this is why we kind of need this more kind of common framework. One thing that Matthias mentioned that I really agree with, and which is actually fundamental to my book, is this idea of ethics as a critical theory, which I agree totally with. So if you look at one of the things that I talk about in my book is this idea of data ethics spaces of negotiation and cultural critical moments, which I actually think is one of the key things that we need to, and one of the key things that we actually see challenged in all areas, not by AI technologies by themselves, but yes, also by themselves, but generally in these debates on data ethics and AI ethics, where I think we tend to get focused very much on this idea of principles and how to then, for example, the big debate at the moment, or the big mantra of all organizations and intergovernmental organizations is moving from principles to practice. While I actually believe that one of the key things that came out of agreeing on these principles and sitting at the table with different stakeholders was this space of negotiation where we suddenly realized that there were some values that were challenged, and we saw how these values were challenged, and we were forced to explicate our values and then try to come up with common agreements around this. And I think that was one of the most valuable thing of this. And that's why it's you know, Matthias, and you mentioned also this thing of trustworthy AI, and it's actually funny because originally we were presented with the title Trusted AI, which was actually something that I was actually the one who suggested the term trustworthy AI. And I'm very sorry for that, because in a sense that I really agree with what you said, that this idea that we just asked, and that was actually the point why I then presented trustworthy AI, was the point to say we should not just be asked to trust these technologies. We should not, we should have some processes in place that ensures that we have this kind of, that we constantly have this critical agency that is so fundamental to democratic societies, and that is empowering us in these processes when we are creating technologies to actually, for example, see things like discrimination or bias in technologies, to realize that what we're doing is, it might have an ethical implication, a social implication. But if, for example, we create a technology, and there's different ways of creating technologies, of course, but if we, for example, create an AI technology and say this is a trustworthy technology, push it into the world, and then leave the ethical agency to this AI to make the decisions for us, we've already lost, and we don't have a trustworthy technology because we don't have a trustworthy process where we have incorporated the critical agency in humans of these technologies. So I don't know, I'm going in all kinds of directions. Did I answer any questions, Gianluca, or did I just...
Oh, thanks a lot. And yes, I mean, we are warming up, I think, the debate here, and there's a lot of interesting issues coming up. So I would suggest to start taking some questions from the audience, and then we can also go back on some of the issues, because clearly there are aspects that are part of, let's say, of the current discussion, issues that also are linked to the specific research each of you is doing. But let's first see what, I mean, if there is any specific question. Also, we can then see with Oscar and colleagues how we then proceed for the pose later on. But let's see, let's open the floor, because as we say, otherwise we don't have time later, because we know that then once we start there are a lot of questions. So who is the first to break the ice? Okay, Jose Maria. Yes, I didn't see the
very excellent. I really like all the dispositions. Yeah, I'm as medical doctor and engineer, I'm thinking about how to, you talk about artificial intelligence ethics and the healthcare ethics. And I think in this moment there is for medical doctors, for example, they have huge questions in this topic, because technology evolves really fast, and you can have, depending on your ethics, feel that you have to take care using medicine with patients with different technologies. And I don't know if there is some discussion inside the European Union about this topic, especially after COVID issues. And I don't know if you can give me some advice about this, to talk with colleagues about this topic on ethics and artificial intelligence in healthcare. Thank you.
I don't know if we want to collect maybe 2-3 questions, and then we have a round of answer. Alex?
Yeah, I'm just curious about what changes we will see kind of following like the Digital Services Act, since it seems likely that I mean, it will proceed. So and good work by Castel Schaldemus, by the way. So.
Okay, I don't know if we heard, because we had your new camera in the background, but okay, so yeah, unless there's any other question, maybe we go to these 2 issues. Yeah, Enzo.
Luca, I wanted to ask, I mean, the whole meaning of trustworthy AI puts a lot of leverage as well on the private sector, because one of the things that comes with this new act and the new methodology is that we also entrust the private sector to be able to release trustworthy AI products. So at the end, the regulatory framework is not anymore on the control only by the state, but is actually empowering an overall view of the control also by society in general, and the private sector in particular. So I was wondering how you all feel about this.
That's the answer. Be careful while driving and talking. So, okay, where we go on these 3? I don't know who want to start, maybe. Yeah, Gri, please.
I can say something about, yeah, I think, and this is one of the key things that we have to think about. and why we have to think about this transformation of power as a basis of everything we do. Because you're completely right. Now I'm answering the question regarding trustworthy AI and the empowerment of the private industry. I don't think it's completely correct that it's putting a lot, well, maybe by the term trustworthy AI, but I think exactly that's why we moved from using the term trusted AI to trustworthy, meaning that it has to prove itself to us. I do think with the AI Act that there's quite it's a risk-based approach and a precautionary approach, which I think is really important. So it's actually more putting requirements that weren't there, where before, I mean, I think I saw, now I've been following this development for so many years, and also with Birgitte and Pernille and with data ethics, we were seeing the ethical implications of many of these technologies. And many of the technologies we didn't even, you know, many of the data-driven technologies and the AI-driven technologies that we've seen, for example, social networking sites and all these kind of things from private actors, and that are now being deemed illegal, sometimes some of the practices in Europe, were not really considered problematic a few years ago. I remember saying this doesn't add up with the fundamental right framework or things like this. So I think more to look at, you know, the AI Act in terms of, I actually think it's more, and even the DSA and the Data Governance Act, it's finally not necessarily saying that they have that private industry has maybe more power, but recognizing that it has responsibility, which a kind of responsibility that wasn't really recognized before. So I would probably think of it differently. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Enzo, at least. I know there was a question before about healthcare and AI also.
Well, the previous question, because Alex was so kind to put it in the chat, is basically he was referring to the agreement of this week on the Digital Service Act, and so what you see are the implications for the for the field of AI, because this is another horizontal, let's say.
I kind of answered what I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think actually where the big battles were standing is not really the AI Act. It's been more in this area. And as I'm saying, historically, if we look at it, the development, the social movement around it, starting with the GDPR and then going around, I think it's finally been recognized that there is a kind of responsibility that is problematic and a power that should be challenged, not recognized necessarily.
Thanks. I don't know if Birgit or Matthias, maybe also on the specific. Matthias.
So Birgit, would you like to go first, or
you go first.
Yeah. Okay. So I have heard three issues. So the first one I would like to comment on is the one, once again, of the common ground or the common morality. And I would just like to clarify. So my idea is not to say there is no common ground, but it's just to be aware that this kind of common ground is very slippery, and that there are gaps, and that there is a need for negotiation. And I think we can easily see this, for example, when we talk about human rights. Within philosophy, there is this large debate if we do need a universal human rights approach, or if you do need particular civil rights to say, well, in the end, you can have something like a human right and still be a refugee in a small boat on the sea, and nobody cares about your needs, and you do not have a concrete right where to be heard. So this is the idea, for example, by Hannah Arendt or Jacques Rancière or others, to say, well, this is the kind of slippery within this idea of a common ground, that you still are in need to be heard by somebody and be able to put your right on the table. And of course, there are these human rights, and this is no critique against this universal idea of human rights. But in the end, you also need these concrete forms where you can, be heard with your concrete desires and your concrete rights. So this was just about the common in the value or the body of values. The second one, and Birgit, I'm not sure about this. So you say, well, in the end, as a lawyer, you say, well, I just just apply formula guidelines, yeah, or rules. Okay, so yeah, I know, but I'm not sure if it's really that easy. So I have a lot of debates with other colleagues in law, and we always have this point where we say, well, in Germany we have this Böckenförde idea, and this guy called Böckenförde has given the sentence to say, well, law depends on frameworks and a set of rules. It cannot develop or guarantee on its own. So also law or also the rules depend on a specific set of political negotiation, on a political state of law, and so on and so on. So there, I think still within law, we do have debates. What is our rationale to prioritize this kind of principle above another principle? So it's not about, and there's this joke, yes, so you have one lawyer and 3 opinions, or you have two lawyers and 4 opinions. So I think it's not that clear, or there still is this need of interpretation and to be transparent about your preliminary beliefs and values you put on the table and you use to decide what kind of regulation you choose or which pathway you would like to proceed. So, and my last one, and to make it a bit more concrete, so I think this is also an important aspect about the AI Act, because there is this debate. So what is the fundamental idea within this regulatory approach of the AI Act? And I really like the idea brought forward by, for example, Luciano Floridi or others who argue to say, on the one hand, it's necessary to focus on a risk-based approach like the AI Act. But once again, with regard to the field of medical ethics, there's also a shift. So when you use a risk-based approach, you have a tendency not to, at the same time, use a person-centered approach. And this is a kind of dilemma, or this is the kind of struggle you always have to say, should we use a risk-based approach? But what does this mean for individual rights? What does it mean for an individual person, or the perhaps older ideas of using regulation in the terms of a person-centered approach? And you can see this with regard to facial recognition or other approaches. Then you say, well, what is the argument against the use of specific forms of facial recognition? With a person-centered approach, you can easily argue against this. But with a risk-based approach, you have to use other forms of argumentation and line of interpretation to justify this or to argue against this. And this is just why I think that it is really important to critically think about this idea of a common base and what this would imply for developing governance in the sense of hard law, of soft law, but also, and we haven't talked about this, of new forms of empowerment. Yeah, so to my understanding, this is also important out of a governance perspective, that it is about a participatory approach and allowing different stakeholders, allowing also perhaps critically groups with a critical perspective to engage in the development. So it's a task for civil society, and I think it's really a difficult also political task how to integrate different perspectives from civil society in the development of something like a new regulatory form. And this is really an important issue. And then we are, once again, at the point where we say, well, what do we mean with control? So there has been this question of control and controllability. And I think this is really an important point that, and this is something in the center of the work my group and I are working on. So how can we develop new forms of controllability? How can we think and understand the needs of controllability with, for example, regard to technical forms of custodianship or forms of technical stewardship, in order to allow control in a really complex network, and with really not knowing what the specific form of artificial intelligence is used for. So you have this lack of information, a really high degree of complexity, and you still should be able as an individual entity to take decisions. So you need, in order to have something like control, or to be able to gain controllability, you will need technological systems to allow you this form of control and controllability. But this also has consequences. As you know, in Denmark, you have central registers to say, well, and then we can guarantee this form of control perhaps more easily than in Germany, where we say, well, we have decentral structures, and it's really hard to develop forms of technological custodianship, for example. Just as a thought.
Okay, I think I have three things. First of all, I think we should leave that for now, but it is true that when we open up for the whole discussion of the validity of law, then we dive into a huge discussion within law and philosophy. And I have been very much involved in that for many years. But I don't think, I mean, I don't think that fits for this purpose here Saturday morning. But it is true, it is a huge discussion, and it's not an easy discussion. So it was just to say that as a point of departure, sometimes it is good to remind yourself that we have legislation stipulating principles and values, and we have to implement them. That's the whole idea of having legislation, that there's a political will actually to say this is what we want, and then it's left for others, authorities, companies and so forth, actually to implement and comply with the rules. That was just briefly on that. Then the other thing that you say when talking about the risk-based approach, when we apply that within the EU context, also if you look into the AI regulation, then it's about persons. It's the risk. It's a fundamental rights risk-based approach. So we look into the risk for individuals or for the public interest, but the public interest is not the societal interest. It's the interest of all of us together. So all citizens together would be the public interest. And so to me, the risk-based approach is extremely strong, because we have, especially when we have the AI regulation and it's intertwined with the GDPR. So you cannot apply the AI regulation without also ensuring that you comply with the GDPR. And that's why the risk-based approach becomes very strong. And also, I think that's the beauty of the two regulations right now, that they actually say, this is not a checklist. Find out, assess your risk in your specific context, and see how you can actually comply with the principles and values. And that I like very much. But then I would like to just go back to, was it Enzo who asked, what about the companies? What about private sector and all these new rules and expectations and all that? How do they deal with that? And then seen from my team, I work together right now with 5-6 of large multinational corporations, some of them in the pharma industry. And what I can see is that they are actually very committed to set up internal code of conduct, data ethics position papers, AI position papers, and so forth, where they define how do we tackle this in our organization. And of course, because they are multinational, they have to draw on different legal traditions, different perceptions, and they are really doing a great job in order to find out how they can solve this and how they can contribute to moving forward with new types of technology, especially AI, and at the same time respecting core values such as the right for dignity and privacy and so forth. And it's, of course, is also, some of it is also driven by legal departments and the quest for compliance. But I think very much it's also very fruitful and very interesting discussions that they have about their purpose and how they want to engage with the customers, especially in the pharma industry. How is it that we transform this idea of including people, including citizens, including customers into our processes? So I think instead of looking at it as an obstacle, I think these, at least the companies that I work with, they have chosen to see it as an opportunity, to get better, and then you may, cut it down to, it's all about the customer journey. How do we make the customer journey more efficient and more interesting? But what I see is that there are all these new aspects that are actually included in the discussions, in the strategies and so forth, which I see as a very positive thing.
Thanks a lot. Sorry, I couldn't unmute. And now we were also trying to organize for the next after the panel. So, so any other common questions from the? Okay, I see Heimer. I had no doubt about it. And so, and if others want to join, maybe probably we do the last round. And so.
So thank you to all the speakers. This is a very interesting discussion. I particularly appreciated Gree's description of data as also the history of power. And I think it's important to remember that we're not just talking about digital data, but that there have been other types of data systems throughout history. I was listening to a talk the other day on the Inca civilization, which was a highly centralized civilization, and how they used census data, which they codified through textiles. So basically tying knots. So there is a long history of data being tied to power. I also felt it was very important to make that distinction between weak and strong forms of digital sovereignty. And there's a lot of discussion at the moment around how sovereignty can operate at different levels. So it can be individual level, community level, city level, state level. And I'd be interested to hear the speakers' views on some of the experiments that are currently going on around different forms of data sovereignty and different ways of managing data collectively. So sharing data like data trusts and data cooperatives. Barcelona is obviously a key example, but also indigenous communities have been doing some work in this area. And then finally, I think it's also helpful to think about how the value of data is measured. So if we think of data not just in economic terms, but also of the social and potentially environmental benefits that it can bring, does that change the equation? And thinking about how data is fundamentally collective and therefore has network effects, and so should be stewarded perhaps in a more collective way. So I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on those points. Thanks.
Thanks, Heimer. I see also Ardita, and then I know Ala also. I don't know if she wants to then intervene. Ardita, please.
Yes, thanks, Gianluca. Actually, we are right now living in an era where we are witnessing decolonization of the data, and we are looking at different sources really producing data. Before, it used to be state statistical office has the data and we act upon this data because that is the really official entity that we have. And then we really trust state statistical office, what they say, but not the others. And now it's more diverse than ever. We have data lying with state institutions, we have data lying with private sector, we have data lying with startups, and we have all these different actors who are actually coming into the ecosystem with different data. And as somebody who is working in order to enhance the public sector, I think the partnerships are even more important than ever. And how do we actually create an enabling environment that would enhance this partnership between these different things? Because it is very important to say, okay, we have complied to all the standards, all the ethical guidelines. And according to these ethical guidelines, we cannot use the data that is coming from X and Y side. And that has been a major case in few of the in few of the instances where I have entities that refuse to accept data that is coming from another entity than the state statistical office, because they say, for us, it's state statistical office and the data should come from there. On the other hand, we have collective intelligence that is going out there in different areas and we don't really tap into them. So how we could enable this environment to really have all these different sources really feed one another.
Thanks, Ardita. And so, because I think Ala cannot open her microphone. So she wrote a question that is also very relevant, is about AI codes of ethics, as they differ from one sector to another. For example, on AI for defense, that is critical on well-being compared to other industries. And also it's not sufficient to apply some principles like transparency on military uses of AI, and that is for security reasons. The question is, do we need specific AI ethics for defense? So an additional question to the two of Eimar and Ardita. So unless there is any other, let's say, question, I would just do a final round with Matthias, Birgit, and Gry. And so addressing this question, and of course, if you have any other comment you want to make. So Matthias.
I think I'd just take the one on data sovereignty and different understandings. So you may have seen that we have published a large review on different understandings of data sovereignty in order to understand what is meant, but what also could conceptually be meant when you speak and think in terms of data sovereignty. So it's not to do a kind of self-promotion here, but just to give you the information that there is some work on understanding the concept and the ideas of data sovereignty and digital sovereignty. And one really important result of this kind of research was that there seems to be a very strong idea also with regard to indigenous ideas of data sovereignty or more geopolitical ideas of data sovereignty, that data sovereignty is another word or is strongly connected to ideas of control and power. So when we think, and of course this makes sense out of a political science and ethics context as well, when you think about different concepts of Hobbes or of Schmidt or of all these guys, where this is one of the strong ideas of sovereignty. But when you then look on the different agents and the different stakeholders, for example, different indigenous groups, you can see that they do have very different understandings of what concrete form of power, of what concrete political aim should be pursued with the same term of data sovereignty. So, and this is really, I think this is really important to understand, that when we use data sovereignty as a political strategy or as a form of a common set of values, or another word for that, that there are really different interests and different ideas, and also different ideas with regard to ideas of identity and political identities, especially with regard to indigenous groups. That this is really a term which is used in very different, or with very different understandings. And this is not an argument against sovereignty, but this is, to my view, an argument for using or understanding sovereignty in such a weak sense, and to make transparent and to be clear about that there are different ideas about what aim should be pursued in the name of such a form of sovereignty.
Thanks, Matthias, and maybe Birgit.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if it's better to take Gry first, but now I just, because I think I'll end with being very pragmatic. Again, by looking into procurement, and apart from what I said when we started, that the structures there, I think there are very good examples in Europe, in the Netherlands and in Finland, Amsterdam and Helsinki. In those cities, they have started working on smart cities, and a lot of those elements have been worked within a setting where they actually work actively with including data ethics in everything they do. And one of the concrete examples that they have, or initiatives that they have come up with, is AI registers. So it's actually possible for the citizens to, if they see that they can download an app, and then they can be told where it's easy to park, what's an easy park spot. And if they want to know, they can go to a website and find out this algorithm, how is it built, who built it, what were the concerns, what were the risk assessments, what did they cover. And I think that's a very good idea also to accommodate what Matthias mentioned earlier, perhaps how it's difficult to find out how do we engage the citizens, but this is a way of transparency that I like very much, and that has actually been introduced in those cities with very good results. Another thing that they have done in the Netherlands is that it has been part of their procurement setup that they work actively with a data ethics requirement in the contracts, and that there are control mechanisms ensuring that the suppliers are complying with the contractual specifications regarding data ethics. So there are a lot of good examples of how you can actually work with this in practice in these two cities. And I think I'll just add it to the chat. That's an article that I wrote to our website on dataethics.eu, but there are links to the two cities and also to the AI registers. So feel free to go and take a look at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Birgit. And as we always say, I mean, only by copying all the comments and references in the chat, we will make an exceptional textbook of AI for government. So thanks all for the rich contribution. So Gry, last comment.
Okay, I'm going to be a little bit, yeah.
just started.
Okay, no, I'm going to take a step and be a little bit like historical and philosophical here, because I think that's really important sometimes when we're in these kind of debates, that we see everything from, you know, the history of things, no? And so I really like to use, and it's something that I use in my book, is the framework of a philosopher called Henry Bergson, who actually lived during in between the First and Second World War, and was writing his theories around that. And actually, in fact, also was, and that is a fact, according to John Humphrey, who wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, he was an inspiration to this. And he was talking about two different kinds of morality. He was talking about a human morality and a social morality. And I think that's, you know, really relevant in terms of the conversations we're talking about now, or we are having right now, because the social morality is this kind of morality that you can code, you can put it into a principle, you will put it into a law, and it's an obligation, and you have to adhere to it. The people that has to implement it has to adhere to it as an obligation. But that also means, and that's something that he experienced very much because he was of Jewish descent himself during the Second World War, was that this kind of social morality can be put aside during times of crisis, for example. So right now, for example, during the pandemic, we do see that our fundamental rights are challenged sometimes. So that's an example of the social morality. If you then think about a human morality, according to Bergson, that's one that you live, you make it part of a cultural process, and it's inclusive, and it's something that you practice as a kind of way of being in the world. And this is very philosophical in many ways, but if we then apply it to our debate right now, then we can think about these principles that we're creating. But if we do not take them in and they do not become part of one, for example, technological culture, designers that are building things like what was mentioned before, for data trust, that are built because they are considered to be a way of empowering consumers. And I'm sure that the people that are building them have this kind of feeling of something needs to change. Or if you do not take it as part of an organizational culture where you suddenly realize, not because you have to comply with a new regulation, but actually because you have people that are working with this business and are realizing either that what is happening is unethical or there's some social implications of what they're doing, you won't have a change in the kind of way that we want change, this kind of socio-technical change where there's more ethical considerations about AI and data. And so that's, you know, very broad and very general, but I think it's the best way we can think of the kind of data ethics and AI ethics we want, where the principles, the regulations, everything that we're creating right now is, of course, this kind of codified social morality. But in the very end, it comes up to all of these things coming together, and the way that we're actually not, I don't want to see moving from principles to practice, but the way that we actually practice the ethics, or the way that we're actually feeling it inside. And that sounds very up here, but that's, I think it's one of the key things. And to be practical then if we really want to then create these practices, these cultural processes that are creating a kind of ethical awareness of what we're doing, then we do have to enable that through technologies that enable critical agencies, or through laws that ensures that there's kind of transparency in practices, that there's explainable processes, different things that will create these kind of spaces where we have this kind of critical human morality. Very broad. I hope it made sense.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Gry. And so I don't know if there's any very last minute. I see Emma still has the hand raised. I don't know if it's from before, I guess.
Sorry, that was a mistake, but thank you for the answers.
Yeah, no, I mean, unless you had any other issues. And so I don't know if there's any other comments otherwise, and unless, I mean, Gry, Birgit, and Matthias wants to add something else, I think was really, I mean, a great way to end this part of the first part of the master, and that is, you know, we are piloting all together, and I mean, we are really happy about how things are evolving. Now we will actually ask to you. I mean, in the exam we will have right now. So, but before that, let's first you know, make a round of virtual applause to Matthias, Birgit, and Gry. So thanks a lot, and I'm sure that we will have more. I mean, we will discuss this issue much more in the coming year. And we see also the small one that actually it will be concerned by how the ethics will be, you know, the ethics of AI will develop in the future from Alex. So thanks a lot to the three of you, and look forward to see you in person again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be part of this.
Thank you for accepting it. And with Matthias and Gry, we will also meet hopefully soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice one.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. And now, I mean, of course, I was joking, you know, there was a last day we should have an exam, no? A surprise exam for all of you.